Greetings and welcome back for the second mini lecture of this introductory section. And first of all, I didn't quite plot my time right. I probably needed one more minute. So let me start this mini lecture by summarizing the first lecture and pointing out a couple of the things that are likely to show up as exam questions. Essentially, the first mini lecture had two major ideas in it. The first was this notion that in democratic societies, there is this fundamental tension between two competing values, which I called authority and freedom. Some would call it order and liberty. It could go by a lot of different names. I pointed out that the anarchists tended to be one school of thought that really stressed freedom, that governments are not necessary, that people are basically good. And I contrasted them with fascists who said that individual freedom's a false value, that people aren't good, and that individuals need to be liberated through subjugating themselves to the state. And so the fascists stress authority, the anarchists were stressing freedom. My point is that both are incorrect. That in a democratic society, you understand that both of these are important values, that there needs to be order and a rule of law and authority to govern and, for example, to protect people from other societies and maybe people who are predatory within their own society. So individuals have to give up a certain amount of order for protection. And we give up freedoms all the time. For example, we stop at red lights and stop signs, which regulate our freedom. And we do it for public safety and order. During this pandemic, and the reason we're meeting in this format. And for me, it's unfortunately because I think the face-to-face format is far superior to online instruction. But in this particular case, our schools are closed. A whole variety of businesses are shut down. Once again, because of order and protecting people's livelihoods, so people's freedom. In this case, the freedom to meet face to face in a bar, in a restaurant, or in a classroom is being regulated. And so that would emphasize that authority notion. But we also understand that the majority should not have the right to do whatever they want, that you and I as individuals should have a certain sphere of liberty that the majority cannot intrude upon. And so the paradox of democracy is that while democracy is a procedure, it is a means to make decisions. And while authority figures and government officials make these decisions, they can't decide all issues this way. And I concluded the lecture by pointing out that principled Democrats want to stress liberty, and I illustrated that with the case of Stanley versus Georgia. There you have a classic case of procedure. The state of Georgia had passed a law regulating the private possession of porn movies in people's homes. Mr. Stanley got caught violating the law. He had these movies, but his attorneys appealed this to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state of Georgia did not have the right to regulate this behavior. So Mr. Stanley's freedom, in this case, to watch these movies was upheld. And so the Supreme Court, in case after case after case that we're going to talk about, we are going to see this paradox about what do we protect? Do we protect the authority of the government to make rules for society? Or do we protect the individual's freedom and liberty from restrictions by government? And so that third small number at the top of the paradox of democracy is the paradox of democracy is that majority rule may not, and some would say is not, compatible with minority rights. So as a Democrat, we have majority rule, but we also have minority rights, and these two are contradictory, which makes democracy very, very messy, and in my mind, incredibly, incredibly exciting. So let's move down to Roman numeral 2, systems of democracy, because one of the areas of disagreement is that when people are talking about democracy, they are talking about very different things, and they're using the same word. I call it systems of democracy because I think these people are often engaged in a false argument. I think that all of these are variants of democracy. I'm going to talk about three distinct systems of democracy, and all three of them we find in the United States, although we do not find all three of them in national politics, and I'll make that distinction as we go along, and probably more in the next lecture than this one. I want you to underline two words in that first sentence that you have in your notes, and hopefully you have printed these notes and are following along in lecture. If not, it's okay because I'm reading along as I'm commenting. Systems of democracy rest on the notion of popular sovereignty, and I would underline the words popular sovereignty. And essentially, when you're talking about popular sovereignty, you are making the claim, you are making a basic assumption. In the notes, I use the term basic principle, that it is the people that are the ultimate source of governmental authority and of the policies that governmental leaders make, because we put those people into office. And so even though we may claim that we're upset, some people in this class may not like President Trump. Other people may not like Governor Newsom. There may be some of you in here that don't like either one of them. But you could make the claim that through elections, these people were voted into office, and therefore were ultimately responsible for these governmental officials. Now, the central idea, once again, according to Greenberg, your textbook author, is that ordinary people want to rule. They're capable of doing so, and this is very, very different than, say, the Communist Party oligarchy in China, or a dictator like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Certainly, there is no question that America has become more democratic. Over the years, it is approaching democracy. But it's my belief that democracy is a concept that can never be fully achieved. It's like perfection. You can get closer to it or farther away, but it's an elusive concept. So, for example, if we just look at one element, going back to voting, there are people who can vote today who once upon a time could not vote. For example, women could not vote. People of certain races could not vote. We still do have barriers. For example, today, the primary barrier that separates who can vote and who can hold office is age. We set a rather arbitrary date for voting. We say that people must be 18. At one time, it was 21. There are states that are debating allowing 16 or 17-year-olds the right to vote. So we do still have arbitrary standards, even when it comes to voting. And of course, there are also other barriers, whether there are attempts to engage in voter nullification to make it difficult to vote, as is claimed in many states, particularly in the South. So I want to talk about three potential systems of democracy: direct democracy, indirect democracy, and another term for indirect democracy is a republic, and pluralism. And I told you that all three of these do exist. They all exist at the same time. but they're very, very different. If you want to draw a little diagram, and I told you I'm not technological, and I think this will be Exhibit A in that proof, take a look at how I draw a direct democracy. And there you can see it. Well, let me get it in the picture, direct democracy. And with direct democracy, there are two circles. They're supposed to be circles. They look like bad lumps. But you can see that in a direct democracy, people make laws themselves. There is no intermediate step there. Citizens are making laws without representatives. Common people rule directly in open assemblies, implying face-to-face deliberations and decision-making about public business. So we can find examples of this in some cities. We can find examples of this even to some degree, some would argue, in some states, and I'll talk about them. Historically, the classic example of this is ancient Athenian democracy, where citizens could meet, could discuss issues, and vote. In America today, the state that has the most of these town meetings, the New England town meeting, is the state of Vermont, where typically voters, citizens get together, usually in a high school gymnasium. They usually go all day on a Saturday, and depending on the size of the town, there may be one or two of these a year. Maybe they even have one every other month or so. So I would say that 2 to 6 a year qualify, and so people get to hear the arguments on both sides. Now, some people say that this isn't as great as you might think, because it probably would not surprise you that the average age in Vermont of people who show up on a Saturday all day in a high school gymnasium tend to be older people in their early 60s, and young people and younger voters tend to opt out. And so the argument is that public policy really gravitates towards those who are more affluent and older, because they're the ones who show up. In the state of California, we have an excellent example of this. This is called the initiative process, and many of you in here perhaps have participated in this. If you have perhaps gone out to the Quad before we shut the campus down with this pandemic, but often there would be people out there asking you, are you registered to vote? We're trying to qualify this measure for the ballot. About half of American states have the initiative. I believe now 23 or 24 states have it, which means 26 or 27 does not. So in California, if you get enough signatures that are valid, that measure is then placed on the ballot, and voters have the opportunity to vote for or against that proposed initiatives. Now, certainly this is not what the ancient Greeks had in mind, where there would be a meaningful discussion of the issues. The pro and cons would be explored, and everyone would get an opportunity to hear those arguments. Instead, in California, when we have initiatives, there are very misleading advertisements on both sides. These initiatives often are given slogans and titles, and we market these things like underarm deodorant and toothpaste. But remember, the definition of direct democracy was citizens making laws without representatives. So in our state, in California, we have a process where we, the people, citizens, can lobby, can try to gather signatures, and can actually place a measure on the ballot. And if the people vote for it, it becomes a law. It can even become a constitutional amendment without the direct intervention of any elected representative. And so it's really kind of intriguing. We'll talk about this more in the next lecture.